Next on our agenda, we are going to start our final interviews for Superintendent of Schools. Our first interview is Dr. Michael Lonze.
Isn't it nice to have power?
Oh, yeah.
How are you?
Would you just like me to begin? I'm sorry, I wasn't sure.
Oh, yes. Now, when you're ready, please
Okay.
begin.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again for having me tonight, and thank you for joining me in our journey about my vision for the Walled Lake Consolidated School District. The areas of focus tonight will be safety and security, student achievement, fiscal responsibility, and staffing. Obviously, there's more to this. These are just
Can we turn his mic up?
I probably wasn't speaking into it. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
These are just the 4 areas that I'll be focusing on tonight. Safety and security. As the board knows, we began our in-person options training back in last December. Very quickly after that, we partnered with Navigate 360 in their ALICE protocols. Our local law enforcement was very pleased that we embraced the ALICE protocols, as that is a training that they've received, and we continue that process through today. This summer, all of our staff received an online module that they were to complete as the first step in the ALICE training process. And as the board's aware, in September, we will be doing our in-person ALICE training building by building with our local law enforcement agencies. We'll then continue throughout the rest of the school year to practice drills with our students and staff. And by the end of the school year, I'll be pleased to report to the board that all of our students and staff will be ALICE certified. That's a great next step to ensure our safety and security for our district. As a part of that, though, it's important to always have outside agencies, outside companies come through and give you their perspective. And so we did engage with a third-party company who has come to every one of our buildings and done a physical safety assessment along with assessing their policies and procedures at the building level and our policies and procedures at the district level. That was postponed slightly because of the bond schools and the opening of Dublin and the opening of the Early Childhood Center. So we wanted to wait to make sure that we had all of our buildings ready to go. So that company is finishing up their assessments by the end of this month. And then shortly I'll be able to bring back recommendations to the board as to what our next steps could be based on their assessments. The next item is called TSIP training. And what that stands for is Traumatic Event Crisis Intervention Plan Training. Now, you may have heard that in some of the most recent tragedies and events that we've had in our country. They talk about different roles that people are supposed to play. And this training provides that as to what role everyone on the district and building crisis team is supposed to play. It also gives us common language, as most of the municipalities around us and agencies that we'd be working with have gone through this training. Right now, we only have a few people trained in the district, I being one of them. Throughout this school year and into next school year, depending on when the training is available, I'd broaden that training to all of cabinet and then build down into our building leadership. That way we have people cross-trained, and once you know your position and your role, you can do that in any location, any situation. So an example could be we have a flood in a building while we have students there, a pipe burst. That's a crisis that we would dispatch the district crisis team to. We'd work with the building crisis team, first of all, obviously, to make sure the students are safe, and then we'd figure out what our next steps are there. Are we going to dismiss back to parents? Are we going to continue school, et cetera? So that's the purpose of the TSIP training, and something that I support moving forward as, again, another layer of that safety and security for our district. And then finally, we would look at fully implementing our MTSS process. And that you may be questioning, why would that be under safety and security? Well, as some of you may know, there's two main parts to MTSS. One side of it is our behavior and social and emotional side, and the other side is our academic side. So I like to talk about the behavior and social and emotional side as it comes to safety and security. We know that if we have students that are in crisis, that they need additional support. We know that if we have students that are having behavioral concerns, they need additional support. And so what our MTSS process does is it helps to identify those students, and then it helps us to identify what interventions we can put in place to help those students be more successful at school. We know that students that are successful at school and are involved in school like school, and that's a safer environment for everyone. Student achievement. The first part of student achievement that I would work on is exploring our competency-based education. You may remember from my first interview I talked about at Fraser High School, we went from a traditional high school and a traditional model into a competency-based school. That was about a 4.5 year process. That is a process that I would like to begin in Walled Lake and take Walled Lake through. Just to give a couple bullet points on what competency-based education is. At the highest level, competency-based education is forming a movie of learning, not just a snapshot of learning. And an example of a snapshot of learning is we give an assessment today, whatever you score on that assessment is what you get, and then we move on to the next unit, next chapter, next concept. In competency-based, what we do is we give that assessment, and then if you're not successful at it, we give you a remediation and intervention, and then you retake an assessment on that same topic. It wouldn't be the same assessment, and you continue to do that until you can prove competency. And so a good way to remember competency-based education is that learning is over time, and time is the variable, right? So it's not a fixed moment in time for learning. Learning is what goes in and out of our time frame. And so that's a high-level view of competency-based. I'm happy to give more information if you'd like more information on that as we progress through tonight. The second part of that, though, is our learning management system. And right now, those of you that may have had students that have accessed Google Classroom, that's a version of a learning management system. There are many other learning management systems out there and available. Maybe Google Classroom is the right learning management system for us to have. What we need to do is we need to set the criteria for our learning management system, and we need to set the expectation for our learning management system. And we do that collaboratively. We do that with our stakeholders to say, what do you need out of a learning management system? And then we see if that criteria and those expectations, what learning management system can deliver that. Now, you might be asking, okay, well, why do we really need a learning management system? What a learning management system does is it allows equal access to education to everybody, because you have the opportunity to access that education at home, you have the opportunity to access that education in person. As we continue to build out our one-to-one initiative for our secondary students, it's a leveling of the playing field. And so it doesn't matter where you live, where you come from, what your family has as resources. Everyone has access to the same information. Also, as an educator, it was great for me to have it because it was a place for me to archive what I've done for the day. So that if a student missed a day, I could say, okay, why don't you go to what we did, pull it up online, ask me questions as you go through that. And so it helps put the onus and responsibility onto our students to take that initiative, which is what we want. We want our students to be in the 21st century. We want them to persevere. We want them to take initiative. At the same time, we want the safety nets to support them. And so this learning management system allows for that to happen in a way in technology that we don't have available today. We then move on to our focus on high impact teaching strategies. That's not a new focus. We've been doing that here, and every successful school district has been doing it for a long time. Here we've been doing that recently through having our instructional specialists at the elementary level, and then we are in the process of hiring instructional coaches at the secondary level to help our teachers implement those high impact teaching strategies. And how do we do that? We do that through a cohesive professional learning plan. Mrs. Kolansky and her team has developed a fantastic year-long plan that has threads running through it, so we know where teachers are going to start at the beginning of the year, and we know where they're going to end at the beginning of the year, end at the end of the year with their professional development. Obviously, with the bullets 1, 2, and 3, that would lead next year and the following year and the following year professional learning plans based on implementing those 3 bullet points. And then we get to come back to our MTSS process. As mentioned a second ago, we had that behavioral, social-emotional side. Now we have the academic side. And so MTSS also allows us to identify students that are not being successful academically and look at what interventions, and most of the interventions in MTSS are designed to be short-term interventions to help our students be more successful academically. However, no Tier 2 or no Tier 3 intervention can take the place of solid core instruction. And when we talk about solid classroom core instruction, that's our Tier 1 instructional model. And that's what we continue to work on and build to on those bullet points above the MTSS process there. We need to complete an audit of our special services department and our CTE programs. We know that we have great programs and great departments in both of those topics. However, we need to evaluate what our strengths and opportunities are there. When I look at our CTE program, we have opportunities to grow that. One area that we have to grow it in is financial literacy. That's now a requirement from the state of Michigan that we offer that class and that students take that class or through a personal curriculum replace it with another class. So that's a challenge for us in front of us and an opportunity to, again, reevaluate what we do for our students related to career and technical education. As far as our special services department, we have the opportunity to continue to look at how are we assisting and helping all students, specifically in inclusion. How are we allowing all students to access every part of our school environment, not just academically, but our clubs, activities, and athletics. And so that would be part of that process and part of what I would come back to report to the board. Here are the areas that I believe that we can show improvement and opportunities for us to grow and develop. And finally, to continue data reviews in a slightly different way. We would do data reviews at the cabinet level. We would then do data reviews with our building administrators, and then they would continue to do data reviews with our staff. The different part of that is right now we don't do data reviews in totality with our leadership. And so we could do that 2 or 3 times a year. I think there's a lot of value in hearing what other schools' data looks like and how it looks to your school and how you can help each other if there's deficiencies from one school to another school. And so that would be a system that I would put in place so that we could help build that collaboration and help build all of us up together. And that's one thing, that's a great thing about our leadership team, is that we have 12 elementary principals. All of them want the next principal to be better than what they are. And so it's not a system, and I've worked in a school system where principals haven't necessarily been as collaborative because they didn't want to be the principal that wasn't the highest achieving principal. And it's a great synergy that we have at all levels because all of our principals just want what's best for each other. And there's not that protection of information. It's, this is what's working for me. Let's see if it'll work for you. And so that's that next step in that process. Fiscal responsibility. Everyone on the board is well aware that we continue to have a structural deficit, and we have had a structural deficit. That's nothing new. That relates back to our declining enrollment. And when we go back to my previous interview, I talked about that bubble in that 8th, 9th grade year. We know that that bubble will continue to move forward. And as part of how do we address that, we need to do a facilities assessment. And part of that facilities is determining the efficiency that we have. And an outcome of that could be a right sizing of the district. An outcome of that could be redistricting of the district. But we wouldn't know that until we go through the process. And I mentioned that again previously at my interview, that there's a process to that. The first part is engaging and gathering the data from the company that's going to do the assessment. The second part then is sharing that data with our stakeholders and asking for feedback. The third part of that is building goals and strategies around the feedback and the data that we have. The next part is to develop a plan and then share that plan with our community and ask for their feedback. And then the last part is implementation. That's not something that you would start in November and be done with in June. In my opinion, that's a minimum of a 2-year process. We have to remember that if redistricting or right sizing comes out as part of this process, that's a very emotional reaction for people that have to move buildings. And that's something we can't take lightly. And so a well thought out and well developed plan that goes a little bit slower will pay off huge dividends in the end. The next part is evaluating schools of choice. That as the person who is in charge of school of choice currently and the person who helped with schools of choice for 4 years in Assistant Superintendent of Human Resources, we have open seats. Most of our open seats are in the south end of the district. And so we have to evaluate how can we better target people to come to the south end of our district and fill those seats. That's a way that we don't have to always think about cutting or think about redistricting or think about right sizing. That's a way that we can increase enrollment up to our cap and help stem off that declining enrollment. I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying that it hasn't been thought of. Please, it's not a unique idea. I just didn't come up with this. What I'm saying is that would be a focus that I would have and our team would have moving forward, is to dig into the metrics more deeply as to how can we fill the spots that we have. And finally, proper funding. As a superintendent, it's my job to advocate for that. I appreciate the board and everything you do to advocate. We're a team together on that, and we're not the only ones to do it. We have many members of our community that are happy to advocate with us. And so to help with our fiscal responsibility, those are 4 areas that I would focus on. Staffing. Enhance new staff member orientation. And what I mean by that is that every new staff member coming into Walled Lake would have a half a day to a full day of orientation before they begin their position. And it's important for the staff member to understand our values, our expectations, to understand our culture, and to start to feel like they're part of the Walled Lake family. And I'll end with that in a second on this slide. The next thing that I would look into is expanding our teacher cadet program. I'm very proud of the fact that as Assistant Superintendent of Human Resources, I worked with the teachers at Walled Lake Central, and we were able to implement our teacher cadet program. Dr. Stout and her department has been integral in doing that as it's part of our CTE program. So when we talk about expanding our CTE program, expanding it to get more teachers is a wonderful idea. I know that when I was Assistant Superintendent of Human Resources, I interviewed a number of graduates from Walled Lake that only wanted to come back and teach in Walled Lake. I mean, they would have taken a job somewhere else, but they really wanted to teach in Walled Lake. And so to expand that can only benefit us. It could benefit the profession in general, but I'm going to be a little selfish and say, come back to Walled Lake and let us work with you on that. So expanding that to Walled Lake Northern and Walled Lake Western is something that we should look into, and there are grant funds to do that. It's not an easy process, so I don't want to say it would happen in the next 30 days because there's a lot of training that the teacher has to go through. It's a different type of training than what any teacher typically goes through. And so it's a process, but it's something that I believe is important for us to help stem the tide of not having enough teachers to be able to hire. And finally, the Walled Lake family. We know that people that feel cared for, valued, and supported, they feel part of an organization, they want to stay with that organization. And the culture in Walled Lake is fantastic. And I want to continue to increase and enhance the culture in Walled Lake because we know the best way to get good employees is to have our employees currently talk to their friends, their families, their colleagues, and say, you want to come work in Walled Lake. And so that has to be a goal of ours to help differentiate ourselves from other schools in Oakland County. The bottom line is the counties around us have enhancement millages, and they're going to be able to use that enhancement millage to increase their staff salary, all of their staff salary. So our competition can outspend us. But what they can't do is they can't replicate the feeling of being in Walled Lake. And that's what we have to continue to grow and support so that our staff feels a part of that. And that goes back to finally, we need to care, value, and support all of our staff because every day, everything that they do is important. I'll be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Mrs. Casagrande?
I have a quick question for you, Dr. Lonze. You mentioned in staffing you wanted a full day orientation for new staff. What do they get now?
Our new teachers get a full day. Our current staff members do not receive any. That's not entirely. They come in for an onboarding, but that's just a couple-hour process. This would be a very structured time frame that focuses more on culture, climate, values, and expectations.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Lonze,
Yes, Ms.
when
Dunn.
you talk about auditing the special education department, can you dig a little deeper into that and let us know what would you be auditing? What would that look like?
Sure. I think the first step for me, as I try to plan out my life, and I'm a little, 24 gold, so I might be a little too rigid in how I look at this, but I start out by saying, what do we have in every building that we have as far as programming goes? How many students do we have? What do the staff look like as far as number of staff? And so that's our starting point so that we know what we're talking about building to building. And then from there, we can paint the picture of what it looks like in the entire district. We have X number of this program, X number of this program, X number of this program. And that's really the easy part of it. And with that, we can tie FTE to that. We can tie money and how it's spent to that. We can look at other types of supports that go into those programs. And so that's step one. Step two, I would say, is a more qualitative approach, which is what are we doing specifically to support all students in every building to make sure that they have an environment that they can thrive and be successful in. One example that we do is we have PALs, right? That's one opportunity that we have for students to help other students to feel more comfortable and to feel more involved. I know looking at those programs and making sure that we have consistent implementation of those programs throughout all of our buildings, it would be a part of this audit. Another part of it would be what have we discovered along the way? And it's not something that I've been a part of. I don't think we've done a systemic audit like a few of the things that I've shared with you. So I'm sure we're going to have aha moments to say, wow, we didn't really think of that. And then what we want to do after we have gathered at least that information, if not more, and obviously I'm open to suggestions that people might have, is that we then benchmark that against what we can learn from other districts in the county that we think have an amazing special education department or special services department, and look at what can we do differently or what can we do better to help meet the needs based on other districts that are successful around us. One thing that I'm very proud of that we're able to do, Ms. Moore and Mr. Swinehart have been able to get a unified sports team that will be participating in the winter, the winter with basketball. That's something that has been in the works to do, but COVID put us back a little bit, and now we have the opportunity to do that. But if we would have done this audit, we would have noticed that that's something that we don't have that a number of other districts around us have. And we may decide, yep, we want to do that. There may be opportunities that we say, okay, they do that. That just doesn't really fit into our model, right? So it's not a copying of any other district. It's looking at the best information we can gather from them and make sure we're having the best practices that we have here. Does that help? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Lonze?
Yes, ma'am.
With these audits that you're talking about, are you talking internal audits, or are you talking about bringing somebody else in to audit our systems and what we're doing?
So we're very fortunate that we have Oakland Schools, and they have two departments that could help us with that. Obviously, they have a special services department, and that they also have a career and technical education department. And so to Mrs. Dunn's question, when I talk about finding out what our best practices in the county, there are people that consultants that I would bring in from Oakland Schools to say, okay, this is what we've seen, this is what we have. What are some things that you think we might be missing compared to other districts? Or what are other districts do you think are doing something well, because they have the opportunity to talk to all districts all the time? And then we could follow up with that district. It goes back a bunch of slides ago talking about the security and safety assessment, right? It's easy for me to stand up here and say, well, this is the best practice because this is a practice I believe in. But having someone come in from the outside and say, that is a practice, but have you thought about this practice? So really long answer to a really short question. Yes, we should bring other people in to help cross-validate the audit that we're doing. And maybe there's a better term than audit, I don't know, but how about we say take a deep dive, really get a good understanding of where we are with those programs.
Dr. Lonze,
Yes, sir.
you put a high emphasis on ALICE training and the associative security measures presently being initiated or completed. Do I get the impression that, has that changed a lot since, let's say, November of last year?
Sure.
Is that a new directive now?
So that's a great question, Mr. Peterson. Before November of last year, we did what was called options-based training, which is the exact same concept of ALICE. What ALICE is ALICE gives us a very specific protocol for our training. What we were doing before is we were taking training resources on option-based from all over the country, putting those together, and then we would be doing our own training. What our local law enforcement said is, what you're doing is the same thing as ALICE, but we can't help you at the same level as if you became an ALICE school district because of the contracts that they've signed with ALICE as being an ALICE trainer. And so what we do in philosophy is exactly the same thing we're doing now as we did 3 years ago. What we do in practice is exactly the same thing. The difference now is that we can have a much closer partnership with local law enforcement. We have a systemic process that we follow, and that process is a national process, is recognized nationally. So if you were to say, has there been any major change in what we should do? The answer is no. What I will tell you, though, is that someone my age who's been in education as long as I have been, I was always trained that in a crisis situation, such as an active shooter, you go and hide in the corner. That's what we've been trained to do. Now, under the options base and now following the ALICE protocols, that's really one of the last resorts that you do. And so that has been a change, not in our training. It's been a change in all options-based training throughout the country. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yes, and no.
Okay.
I guess just one simple follow-up.
Sure.
So has it accelerated in that sense in the last 6 months? So particularly the last 3 months that you've been graced with this responsibility, added responsibility.
Well, thank you. It really started to accelerate in December of last year and moved a lot quicker, to the point of which, as you know, we took that day last year and we're taking a day this year. That's a serious commitment that we're making to the training. And this is the first time that we've required all of our staff to take the online training module. So to your point, yes, it has been accelerated since March, May, April-ish to today, and definitely has a much better system in place to make sure that everyone is receiving the information so that not only they can be safe, but our students and other staff members can be safe too.
Thanks.
Mr. Siegler?
Dr. Lonze, when you talk about proper funding, what are some of your thoughts, or how do we attain proper funding?
Mr. Siegler, I am confident that if I answer that question perfectly tonight, I will be recruited tomorrow to go to many different states and explain how it can work for them too. The reality, and honestly, you know way more about this than I do, so I'm not going to act like the expert on this topic. The reality is that there's a limited amount of funds for everybody, right? And so I don't begrudge the decisions that people have to make when it comes to allocating a budget. I'm in that situation myself. We only have limited money, and we have a lot of programs that we want to support. I believe it comes down to the work that you and your colleagues do, combined with the work that a number of other lobbyists do to try to convince, which is not always easy, our legislatures that the way that they're funding now is not appropriate and not working. To your point, you know the study's been out there for 3.5 years now, and I would like to say that it's made an impact, but unless you see it differently, I think it's been read by a few people and talked about by a lot. Yeah. Absolutely. And so I think the best way to get the funding that we need is to keep the conversation going and to be intelligent voters. You know, I'm not saying be a single item voter, but at least be intelligent with your vote, that you're voting for people that at least say that they're pro-education and say that they're pro-educational. Yes, sir.
Mr. Titus?
Mrs. Casagrande?
I'd like to expand kind of in the area of advocacy. One of the things that you mentioned as part of your strategy was enhancement millages, that our competition has them, they can outspend us. Just for the transparency to the public, I know what an enhancement millage is. I'm not sure if the public knows what an enhancement millage is, and I would like to know whether or not you are in favor of an enhancement millage, if that would be part of your advocacy platform.
So just as a background, an enhancement millage is a separate millage that the entire county pays. It comes individually to your personal property tax. It then goes back directly to the school systems within that county, which is fairly unique for Michigan. I won't go any deeper than that, but that's a general concept of an enhancement millage. I am in favor of an enhancement millage. I believe that there are challenges that come with it, but the reality is that we are not being funded adequately by the state of Michigan. And the state of Michigan has actually taken funding away from districts like ours and not backfilled it. And so I think it's a great opportunity for our county to say, yes, we believe in our county schools. Because what we know what the research says, everybody thinks they have a great school. Everybody thinks the other school is not so great. And so this is an opportunity to say, we have great schools here, let's support our great schools. Is it an easy road? It absolutely isn't, because there's still going to be bonds that people are going to be going for. There are other millages that people have to go for. And that's always the challenge when you're working 28 other districts, right? There's competing wants and desires. And it's not easy. A community like ours would be a giving district, right? And that's not an easy sell, because we're already a giving district. How much more do you want to give? Well, okay, so we do have to give money to other districts, but we're getting millions of dollars in replacement of funds that we don't have right now. So it's not as if we don't have a significant benefit from an enhancement millage. It just means that everyone in the county gets the benefit. Those will be our challenges that we face if we decide to move forward with that.
Thank you.
Mrs. Dunn?
Dr. Lonze,
Yes, ma'am.
going back to student achievement, so in regards to the literacy gap, what supports do you envision that we could put in place for all students going forward to close the literacy gap?
So I think the first part of that is to have an effective MTSS process, because that's looking at the data in real time rather than just 3 times a year or 1 time a year. Our literacy gap is significant in certain populations more than other populations, and that's not acceptable. We're not alone in that, but it's not acceptable. What we've done is we've implemented a number of strategies, including our instructional specialists at the elementary level. And I'll just jump back to Fraser for a second. When I was a high school principal, and we would be talking about how would we be spending our 31A money or our at-risk money, and they would talk about putting programs at the high school, I was the first person to say, I'll take all the programs you want, but we're going to get a much better result if you put that in K1-2 than if you put that in 10th grade. I'd much rather have students come to me at grade level in ninth grade than trying to catch someone up in ninth grade, because I can tell you, as someone that's spent 28 years in high schools, that's a very difficult thing to do, to show growth in a high school in almost any intervention program. And so I believe the money that we are investing in our instructional specialists that focus on literacy, pull students out to help them in literacy groups, and that is their main focus in working with our teachers, is to improve the workshop model and the literacy model that they have in their small group instruction. It takes time, though. It's not an instant fix. I do believe, though, and I believe in the program, that over the next year, 2 years, as, again, we won't have interruptions in learning, and I'm not making excuses. I'm saying that that was a fact that it happened. But when you look at what we do now and what we've implemented now, we will see dividends and gains for all of our students, because that's what we have to be about. We're a public education institution. All means all. And other students, many students, need additional supports, and we have supports in place to help students that need those. And that's what that MTSS process can help identify for us very quickly.
Dr. Lonze?
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question kind of back to Alice a little bit in our safety and security. Your role as a superintendent involves the management of the crisis. You've had experience last week with that. You had experience last year with that. Can you explain a little bit about your experience, but more importantly, what you did that you might change, or what you did that you're extremely proud of?
So I'll start with the extremely proud of, and I'll go back a year to Walled Lake Central and the reunification that we were able to put in place to help our students get back with their families. We're able to do that in less than an hour and a half with over 1,000 students, in something that no one had ever trained for or have been prepared for. And that happened because of a team. I'll take the credit that I need to take of putting a team together and helping the team understand what our process is, but it couldn't have happened without everyone pitching in. And so that was an opportunity, and that was really that aha moment for me to say, we really need additional training on how to manage that crisis. We know how to manage through Alice what's happening in the immediacy, but what happens the next 5 hours, 5 days, 5 weeks? And that's what that TSIP training that I mentioned previously, that crisis training that I went through last May, that's what it helps you do. And so as a superintendent, maybe I'm the person in charge of that crisis on site. Maybe I'm not. Maybe it's the building principal who's in charge of that, and I'm playing a support role because they know their building better than I do. And that's part of that training, to know when people show up, what roles do you have, and how do you make sure you protect continuity. And so you might not want the superintendent and deputy superintendent at a place that's in crisis, right? Because you want to make sure that you have that continuity plan. Dan Durkin is never going to be on site because he needs to be in a spot where he can manage the media. He needs to be in a spot where he can do communication, and that's not at that site. And so there was a lot of learning that came from that, and that's something that I'm very proud of. You know, when I look at some of the other moments that I will talk about last week, I was very proud of Monday night. That was fantastic. We got the notice out quickly so our families could make decisions. As you know, I'm a parent of 5. When school's called off, that affects me. And I'm fortunate. I'm fortunate that the kids are the age that they are. I'm fortunate that we have support. But I don't want to act as if that was an easy decision to make. It was a decision that had to be made, and there was no other decision to make, but that doesn't make it easy. And why it wasn't easy is that I know that we have families that when their children come to school, that's the safest place for that child the entire day. That may be the only 2 meals that child gets the entire day. That mom or that dad might have to take work off and not get paid because they didn't go to work that day, and that might mean that they have to make a decision of how they're going to spend their money at the end of the week because they count on that exact amount of money for their check. That's what keeps me up at night, are the families that depend on us for things that we've committed to offering. Monday night wasn't a choice. Now, Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, when the notification went out at 5:45 rather than 5:30, I wish it would have been 5:30. We had a system in place to do 5:30. Most people that I talked to said, well, why didn't you call it Tuesday night? Well, Tuesday night we still had, at 9:30 at night, we still had 14 buildings without power. Wednesday morning, we were down to 4 at 5:15. If I would have called it Tuesday night, that would have been the absolute wrong call to make for all the reasons I just mentioned. The reason why it took the extra 15 minutes-ish is because we were getting conflicting information from 2 of our buildings. And I'm never, if it's under my control, I'm never going to send out information that I'm not 100% certain of. Because what would have been worse, in my opinion, is sending out the wrong information at 5:30 and then sending out new information at 5:45. And so I made the decision to wait the extra 10, 15 minutes to get visual confirmation of the two buildings. And I was happy that we only had two buildings without power, and we were able to run all of our other buildings and all the other functions of the district. So we put different systems in place to make sure that we can get closer to that 5:30 mark, because our goal is always between 5 and 5:30. Actually, if we know for sure, it's the Monday night call where we can make it at 9:30 at night. But again, I'm not going to rush to a call just to make that at that nighttime, because I know that there are families that are depending on us. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Mr. Titus?
Mr. Peterson?
Dr. Lonze, as you know, I have been a long-term advocate of CTE programs
Yes, sir.
vocationally here in the school district. How can you convince me that your statement about complete audit of our special services and CTE programs really will provide some ultimate outcome that would benefit that group of students?
Sure.
In a convincing way?
Well, I can only convince you, Mr. Peterson, if you trust me. So if you trust me and you believe what I'm going to tell you, I hope that it convinces you. I'll go back to my sophomore year in high school. I was very fortunate that my sophomore year in high school that I had a business teacher. And that business teacher I looked at and I said, that is a job that I want to do. And that's pretty unique that as a sophomore in high school, you know exactly what you want to be when you grow up. And so I went to Central Michigan University, fire up chips. I was able to get my business education degree, and I dedicated the next 13 years of my life in the classroom as a business educator, as a CTE educator, as taking students to DECA, which is a nationally competitive group for marketing students. That's my core. That's what I've done. And if you want to look back to what, as a principal, I was able to do at Fraser High School, we were able to expand our health occupation program to hire another teacher. We were able to expand our welding program to hire another teacher. We had a full-service restaurant that every lunchtime serviced our students in our community. So if you believe all those things to be true, then I can tell you that at my core, that is who I am. I believe that our job as educators is to prepare students for their future, whether that be the military, whether that be the world of work, whether that be college. That's our job, is to prepare students for that. And we have to remember that, as I said a little while ago, all means all. And so for the time and energy we invest in one area, we need to make sure that we're doing equal time and energy in another. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean equal funding. It doesn't mean equal FTE, because there's a lot of variables that go into that. But that's who I am, and I hope that you believe me.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm Dr. Lonze. At this time, I'd like to move you down to the table so that we can continue the second interview. Thank you for your presentation. Just a quick couple of housekeeping items. I just want to remind our folks here in the audience that there are feedback forms that can be completed at the end of the interview, and these forms are on the table or will be distributed by Mrs. Sobel. And after the interview is complete, they will be copied and distributed to all board members. And also, Dr. Lonze, all board members will be asking some additional questions. And at this time, as I say, and what? Yeah. Thank you. And also, following the interview questions from the board, there will be an opportunity to have questions from the audience. So our first question will be by Vice President Mr. Siegler.
Dr. Lonze, please describe how some of your previous work experiences outside of Walled Lake have prepared you to be our next superintendent. What do we not know about your background that may make a positive impact on our district?
Well, just as a review, I've worked 24 years in other districts, 3 other districts, specifically Oak Park, Birmingham, and Fraser, also in 2 different counties. And so for me, that's been some of the formative years as my leadership philosophy has developed, as my educational philosophy has developed, as my professional philosophies have developed. And so I believe that as I look at each of those areas, each of those experiences that I've had, I believe that those can impact me as the next superintendent. An example of that is my passion for competency-based education. That's something that I've seen success in. It's something I led success in. It's something that I'm very proud of being a part of. When I was in Birmingham, and this was before we had MTSS processes in place, I put together a team of people, including our counselors, our building school psychologists, and our building social workers. And we looked at students that were not being successful academically, attendance, and behaviorally. And that was one of the first times in Birmingham that we pulled a team together to look at an individual child and to see what we could do to help that child. At the time, there weren't a lot of other school districts doing that. And so that's what has formed me to be a leader. That's what goes back to me when I say all means all, is that we take care of all of our students. We care for, we value and support the Walled Lake family. So that's where I think that outside experience that I've had has definitely formed who I am today and will continue to impact and grow me as I move into whatever position that might be. And I think to expand a little bit, that's also where my 5 years in Walled Lake come in. So I have institutional knowledge of Walled Lake. At the same time, I have experiences from 3 different districts in 2 different counties.
Thank you.
Any additional follow-up on that? Thank you. Our next question will be from Secretary Mr. Peterson.
Dr. Lonze, sometimes it may be difficult to come up with win-win solutions to problems. Think back to a time when you took the lead in arriving at a solution that most satisfied all parties. What approach did you use to find common ground, and to what extent did you get advice from others?
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I'll go back to my negotiation time as Assistant Superintendent of Human Resources. It's hard to get to a win-win situation when it comes to negotiations. And I'm very proud of the fact that for 4 years in a row, we were able to do that with all of our associations. Everyone has competing wants and competing needs and competing desires. And so the first step is to listen, is to hear what other people have to say, is to listen to their point of view, is to ask questions. And when you ask the question, to stop and hear what the person is saying. I'm a note taker from time to time, take notes on what that person is saying. And so as I look to build that win-win outcome, which is that tentative agreement and then eventually the agreement being supported by the Board of Education and by the association, that's the first step, is listening. After that, then comes some explanation and some conversation. And in the best case scenario, we're working collaboratively. As I mentioned last time, there were times in negotiations where we heard of a situation that was a problem and we solved it outside of negotiations. We said, we'll absolutely do that next year. We don't need to worry about this right now. Let's cross it off our list. And that happened because we were collaborative. We kept coming up with different ideas and different solutions. There very rarely, right off the bat, is the one good solution, especially in negotiations, because it's a give and take, not only on that topic, but it's a give and take on how that topic might interact with other topics. And so you have to keep that global vision as you're developing this tentative agreement to make sure you can get to that win-win point. Because ultimately, if people are not happy with the agreement that we've reached, it won't pass. And if it doesn't pass, then nobody wins. That is the absolute worst case scenario in negotiations, is when the membership or the Board of Education does not support a tentative agreement. And so by making sure that that didn't happen, I believe that we've always left in a win-win situation. When have I gone to other people over advice? Very often. I have a number of other human resource colleagues of mine that I would say, this is a situation we're dealing with. What does it look like in your district? Help me understand how you addressed it. I would go to Mr. Gutman, who had been in negotiations before, and ask him his opinion on that. Our negotiation team, 5 of the members have been on the team for more than a year, many for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And so even though I was the lead negotiator, when we would go to caucus, we would have an opportunity to sit and talk it through as a group. Again, I believe that that's how we get to good decisions, is you put the right people in the room and you have the right conversations. And our group would have the right conversation so that we would come up with the best proposal to offer back on the topic. And so advice was both internal and it was external. There were also times that I would talk with our attorneys to say, okay, does this fit within the confines of the law? Is it going to be an unfair labor practice? Those are all conversations that you have to have in real time so that you can keep the process moving forward. And by doing that, it's important to note that for the first 3 years of negotiations, we were continuing on concessionary agreements. But through that negotiation, I was able to build relationships and build trust with our organizations, so much so that organizations would settle before other associations would settle. And if you've been in negotiations for any period of time when you're dealing with 6 different associations, oftentimes that's not the case. And I can only take a small bit of credit for that, because that's fortunately what Walled Lake had with our associations when I walked into the room. They had that trust. So my goal was to make sure that that trust was maintained. And that was through listening, it was through conversation, and it was through collaboration.
Any follow-up questions on that? Thank you. Our next question will be from Treasurer Mrs. Kaplan.
Dr. Lonze, tell us how you have used your knowledge of student learning and educational research to guide professional development, and please provide some examples.
So I'm going to go back to, when it comes to student achievement, the competency-based movement that we made at Fraser High School. And that started by doing our own research. There were a few books that I read on the topic, along with some other members of the administration. There were some conferences that we went to, but we were still pretty much on the cutting edge of it at that time. And so we had the opportunity to sit down together and talk about, what does this look like? We also brought in a company called Modern Teacher, and that's what we used as our teacher evaluation system, because that fit in well with the competency-based system, both of those being research-based. And so what professional development did we do? There were 3 of us that would sit down and put together most of the professional development for the entire district, me as a high school principal, the middle school principal, and one of the elementary school principals. And we would put together the professional development outline and the resources that would go with that for our level, and then we would share that out with our assistant superintendent, and then we would work together as a group of 4 to make sure we had her vision as a part of that, and then we would share that out with all of the administration in the district. And so it was research-based on the 2 fronts of competency-based education and also the modern teacher approach to teaching. And then the way that we did that was by forming a smaller group and then getting consensus in a bigger group.
I just have a quick follow-up on that question.
Yes, sir.
If you become superintendent, what is your vision for developing professional development moving forward, to determining what it should be and what that would look like, how you would determine that?
So it would go by the goals that we have as a district and what are our student achievement goals. And I'd work with Mrs. Kohansky and her leadership team so that we could be collaborative in developing that. In fairness, her team, I think, does a fantastic job of putting together very cohesive professional development that is a nice blend of the district having days and then individual buildings having days. And it's important that our individual buildings still have time, because they're doing initiatives in their building that is important to their culture and to their climate. And so it's the mixture of both and the communication both ways between the building and at the district level to make sure that we're all still working towards the same goals. I'll take it in a little different direction, that in my second year as Assistant Superintendent of Human Resources, when we talked about goals that teachers were to develop, every teacher was to develop a goal to work on for the school year. That goal either had to be related to a building goal, a district goal, or an area that was noted on their evaluation for improvement. And what that did is it aligned us, and it put us all swimming in the same direction and making sure that we knew that what they were working on would benefit not only themselves as professional educators, but would also benefit the building and the district. And so as you look at professional development and you ask me that question, it's a team approach, making sure that we listen to the voices in the room. And then we also have meetings with our principals. As Deputy Superintendent, I have them, and on a different day, Mrs. Kohansky has them. And making sure that as we roll out the professional development plan, that we're getting feedback from our principals to say, yep, this makes sense to me. Because ultimately, many times our principals are the ones delivering the professional development, whether it's from the building level that they plan themselves, or whether it's from the district level that we plan to provide resources for. So it's that two-way communication that is critical to making sure that we have a plan that's effective.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Titus,
Mrs.
I
Casagrande.
have a follow-up on that. So in essence, Dr. Lonze, do you feel that our professional development approach needs to stay pretty much the same and steady? Do you think it's broken, or somewhere in between?
I believe the system itself is a good system that we continue to use. I think we continue to monitor the system and the structure to make sure it's meeting our needs. What the content of the professional development is, that will change over time. So if we decide to do competency-based, that becomes the content of the professional development, of which right now that is not the content of professional development. But the system and process in place, I believe, is effective. However, with any system, you have to do the complete feedback loop and make sure that you're not missing something, because when you become complacent, that's when things start to fail. And so to reevaluate and to have continued conversations about the system is still important, but it is not broken.
Thank you.
Mr. Siegler?
Dr. Lonze, again, as we look at student achievement, competency-based education, the philosophy of remediate until competency is achieved, do we have the funding and staff to do that this time? And do we have the facilities in place to do that?
So one thing that we need to make sure that we have at the secondary level is a one-to-one rollout. Without a one-to-one rollout, it becomes very difficult to do that, and we do have the capacity to do that, and we will be doing that this year. As far as implementing competency-based, it's a matter of will, and it's a matter of desire, and it's a matter of understanding the why. I did not increase my FTE 1 point to implement competency-based. What it is a shift in how we approach learning as an educator. And I'll give you one quick example, if I may. We have, and I'm making this number up, so forgive me, we have 4 ninth grade English teachers at Walled Lake Central. I would submit to you, and I just use that as an example, I don't know this as a fact, that they may be working somewhat independently on their assessments, somewhat independently on what they're doing for a particular genre or a particular unit. What I was able to do at Fraser was to help do what business people call a division of labor. And so if we're doing Romeo and Juliet and then we're doing Macbeth, we both don't need to prep, or all 4 of us don't need to prep Romeo and Juliet. 1 or 2 of us can prep Romeo and Juliet, 1 or 2 of us can prep Macbeth, and then we can cross-share that information. And that's how we actually get to save time and at the same time move forward. But that's a hard shift. That was the hardest shift. Is to trust the person to the right of you and to the left of you, right? It just is. And so if you can get to that point, and you can through professional learning, you can through great department heads that we have, you can through our instructional coaches that we have, but that's the heavy shift, is to say, I don't need to do everything myself. For me, I never really had that problem. I believe that we had a better product when each of us took a particular unit that we worked on. I had 3 other teachers that worked with me when I was teaching the Microsoft class. And so I did Microsoft Word, someone else did Microsoft Excel, someone else did the PowerPoint, and someone else did Access, and then we all came back around, shared it, and that way we could spend our time becoming an expert in one particular area. And I think we have that ability to do that. It's just making sure that people understand the why behind it. It's not because you're not great at Macbeth, it's because we want to make sure that you're spending your time wisely, because it's just so precious and so limited.
Thank you.
Mr. Titus.
Mr. Peterson?
Dr. Lonze, help me out a little bit. That's not one of my greater strengths. Believe me, I'll be first to admit it. At this level, the collaboration level, from what I understand you're telling me, is really coming from within the administration here at the board level, and then at the administration level at each of the individual schools, correct? Or are the shareholders, like the teachers, how involved are they in this overall process? And if not, is there a projection for them to be more involved going forward?
So ultimately, I believe that it is my responsibility and cabinet's responsibility and leadership's responsibility to set the compass point of where we're going as a district. We're all going to head in this direction. But to your direct point, Mr. Peterson, is that this work happens in the department level. It happens in the individual classroom level. So the question is, how do you make that happen, right? Well, there's a couple, I wouldn't say easy ways. There's a couple ways to make that happen. One, we can just say, this is what we're doing and do it, right? Well, I can pretty much guarantee that's going to fail, right? There's not been a lot of success in history to say, this is what we're doing, now I need you to do it. Where the success comes from is being systematic of how you rolled this out. And so one thing that I did is I presented as a principal to my staff and said, this is what competency-based education is. And then afterwards, I went to the individual department heads and said, is anyone in your department even interested in this topic? And we as educators, we have people that are interested in it. And so we chose the 10th grade English department to be the first department to pilot what it would look like. And then at every staff meeting, they would talk about all the great things about it, and then I'd make sure they talked about all the challenges that came with it, because any change in process is not just wonderful roses and sunshine. There's a lot of challenges that go with that. And during that time, it built capacity within the building that the other teachers saw that there were significant advantages of this. Ultimately, every teacher wants to make sure that the student understands and learns the content that they're in charge of. That's at our core. And so when I can give you a way to do that, that helps to ensure that that learning is taking place, that already speaks to you. The challenge is, how can I help you do that in a way that doesn't bury you in time, work, and energy? So one example of that is we only had one German teacher at the high school. Well, I didn't ask the German teacher to switch all of her 5 classes to competency-based in 1 year. We did a 4-year rollout for her so that she could take year and year and year and year, because it is a lot of work, especially if you're a singleton. And me being someone who taught singletons almost my entire life, I can appreciate that. It's also advantageous to start with your freshmen and then roll up from there. That is one mistake that we made, is the early adopters happened to be a number of senior class teachers, and so we had them switch to competency-based, and that was a huge shift for our seniors. And in hindsight, it wasn't fair, and I should have seen that coming. Changing the rules in the middle of the game isn't great. And so that would be a lesson learned for me, is that we start with our 9th graders, we start with our 6th graders, and we roll up from there. And so I believe that as we roll this concept out, that people will understand the value of it, see the value of it, and appreciate the value of it. And we've already taken some of the steps. This wouldn't be a brand new concept. We're naming it, we're giving it language. But if you remember, during COVID times, we did change final exams and how final exams were given. And that's fantastic. I love the fact that we started to identify different ways to assess students. So this isn't brand new information. It would just be packaged in an organized way, in an organized manner.
Thank you. Our next question is from trustee Mrs. Dunn.
Dr. Lonze, please tell us about your experience with coaching and mentoring employees. How will this aid you as a superintendent in Walled Lake, and how will it impact employee retention?
So I'm probably never supposed to say this, but one of the things I'm most proud of is people leaving, but leaving for the right reasons. And I'll give you an example of that. When I was principal at Fraser High School, I worked with 6 assistant principals, 3 at a time. Of those 6, 4 became principals. I'm very proud of the fact that with me working with them, that 4 of them had the opportunity to become principals. 1 turned down a principalship, and the other one, we worked together for 4 years, and then she retired to spend time with her family. So that's something that I'm very proud of, and I'll get to that, one of my core philosophies, in a second. When I look at the opportunities that we've had in Walled Lake, I'm very proud of the fact that I had some impact on Mr. Paddock and the experiences that he had, so that he could get to the next level of the job that he wanted. And I'm currently working with one of our building principals who wants to go into central office. So my goal is not to retain people that want to better themselves. My goal is to support them by giving them opportunity. And I want to be clear, I'm not taking 100% credit, 30% credit, 10% credit for the great work that the people I just mentioned did. They are fantastic people, they are wonderful educators, and they are amazing leaders. I was just happy to be able to give them opportunities to show who they are. The retention part comes in the fact that now you help grow other people so that they can take that position. So if we have a principal leave, I would love to make sure that we have an assistant principal or a teacher leader that has had those opportunities to grow and move into that position. I believe at my core, and I'll end with this, unless you have a follow-up question, is that my job is to make sure that we have great leaders in education. I'm incumbent to do that. What we do is so important, and we have a challenge of convincing people to go into leadership positions. Somehow all the glory of a high school principal and the hours that you put in hasn't really convinced a lot of people that that's the job that they want to go into. And so I need to make sure that I am helping to support people to see the value in that job and to see why that's important. So ultimately, I want to retain you to the point of which you can get the next job that you want. I'd love for it to be in Walled Lake, and I think that, or when I was in Fraser, I would have loved for it to be in Fraser, and if we would have had the openings, the people that I've worked with would have had the opportunity to move into those positions in general. So I'm very proud of the work that I've done with that, and to me, it's incumbent, not just with me, but certainly with all of Cabinet, and I would like to think with all of our leaders that they're looking in their buildings and their departments to say, okay, how can I grow the next person to be valued at that next level?
Thank you. Our next question will, Mr. Peterson, thank you.
Turned it off. Dr. Lonze, help me a little bit with the coaching and mentoring. And I know you've had that as an HR in the district at times, that underachiever type of situation. Can you shed any light on how, what, when, and where on the borderline?
Sure.
Can you help me out there?
Yeah, again. So I'll be very vulnerable now to say that my philosophy has changed dramatically. And a lot of that has occurred here in Walled Lake. Actually, all of it has. And it's because of working with Cabinet and being able to see a different point of view. And I'll give you an example. If we had a staff member that was not being successful when I first arrived in Walled Lake, my default was, okay, let's put them on a plan. If the plan doesn't work, then we get rid of that person and we hire a better person, right? Then that's me being very transparent with all of you. That's not the right approach. And it shouldn't have been the approach I had at that time. And so I'm happy to say that I've grown as someone who continues to learn and continues to try to be a better leader, that now if we have an employee that's struggling, we are absolutely going to work with that employee. We're absolutely going to help with a plan of support for that employee. We're absolutely going to provide as many possible resources as we can for that employee to be successful. What hasn't changed with me is at the end of the day, if that employee cannot meet our expectations, if I would not want that employee working with my 5 children, then that employee is not good enough to work with our 12,500 plus children. The steps I take now are very different than the steps I took 5 years ago. So I hope that answers your question to say that we have high expectations here, that we'll continue to support all of our staff to be as successful as they can. But at the end of the day, everyone has to meet our expectations.
Thank you. Our next question will be from trustee Ms. Van Leeuwen.
I originally was going to pose a negotiations question to you, but you answered it fairly thoroughly, I think, earlier. Okay. So I'm going to move on to decision-making within the district. Okay. And be it a relatively small decision or a very large one that impacts a lot of people. So a new program, something new, something that may be controversial. Mm-hmm. Who do you talk to? Where do you get guidance? What people will help you make an informed decision and maybe a good decision? Hopefully.
Well, we both share that hope, that's for sure. In many ways, it depends on the decision and the privacy of that decision. So I have 2 groups that I go to. One is our internal group, which is our cabinet. My colleagues, I have the utmost respect for them. And I respect them not only as individuals, not only as friends, not only as amazing educators and leaders, but I respect that all of us bring different points of view to the table. And it goes back to when you have the right people in the room, you make really good decisions. And so that's one group that I go to ask questions. As a high school principal, I was responsible for recommending students for expulsion, which is not something that I took lightly as a high school principal. As a deputy superintendent, I'm now the person expelling that student, which is one of the toughest parts of the job. And so there were many times that I would go to colleagues on cabinet and say individually, Mr. Russo, this is the situation, here's all the information I have, what are your thoughts on it? Because I believe that especially with Mr. Russo being an elementary principal and elementary background, he could provide some light in some of my blind spots with that. In different situations that weren't so specific, I mentioned that I have a network of colleagues outside of Walled Lake that I would go to help inform me and to help make good decisions. For example, one of the colleagues I went to when I was named interim superintendent was Superintendent Dr. John Dean, to go to him and say, and John and I did our master's work together.
You've been together for a long time, I know that.
We have been together for a long time. And just I bought him lunch and just have him talk to me about what's the job like. Because I've worked with a number of superintendents. Obviously, Mr. Gutman and I had very deep conversations about it. But gathering different and better information is good for me. Steve Archibald, one of our superintendents just up the road here, I met with him and bought him dinner and said, okay, tell me about the job, right? Because I know I don't know everything. And frankly, I think you could do any job your whole life and you probably don't know everything. But those are people that I can go to and ask questions to that I know will give me their unbiased opinion, because they have no vested interest other than to help me be the best I can be, for the same reason I want to mentor people to help them be the best they can be, is because our jobs are so important.
When do you engage the community?
So we engage the community when it is appropriate, as we decide in what direction we want to go on a major topic. And so an example that we have is when we went to spend the ESSER money, we engaged the community by surveying them to say, what are areas that are important to you? And we use that survey to drive many of our decisions. And so there's opportunities when it's important for us to get that, I'd say, 100,000-foot view from the community to say, these are the important topics to us. And then there are times when we make the decision. Obviously, when I was in charge of it, doing the COVID protocols, those were decisions that we could only follow the advice that we were receiving from the health professionals. And so we engaged with health professionals to develop those policies and procedures.
Thank you.
Mr.
Mr. Titus?
Mr. Peterson?
Dr. Lonze, listen to your response. Great question, Ms. Van Leeuwen. When do you decide to collaborate with the Board of Education?
And I like to believe that in the time that we've had together, that you felt that I have asked opinions and I have been collaborative. A part of how we started off our relationship together was me meeting with each of you individually to find out what was your expectations of me for the period of time that I was in this role. And so as it comes to competency-based education, for example, the first thing I would do with that, after talking with Cabinet and giving Cabinet the overview of that, is coming to the board, and I'd recommend we do a board workshop on it. And we have an opportunity for me to share with you what competency-based education is, to give you an opportunity to educate yourself on that, to give you an opportunity to ask whatever questions you have of me on that. That's a major shift for our district, and it's something that I want to make sure that you're informed on. I want to hear the opinions that you have on that. Back to your question, Ms. Van Leeuwen, is you represent our community, right? And it's important for me to have that understanding and that background. And so that's one example of where I would collaborate with the board on a major shift that we would be making.
Mrs. Casagrande?
Dr. Lonze, I'm going to ask a follow-up question regarding Ms. Van Leeuwen's question about when do you engage with the community. And I believe I heard when we have an internal focus, basically. And if I did not hear that correctly, please correct me. And if I did hear that correctly, could that sometimes be too late? Are you potentially saying we would go to the community when we had an idea of what direction we would want to go? Would we maybe sometimes want to go to the community when we weren't sure what to do to get a different opinion?
So, and yes, Ms. Casagrande, I would agree with your recounting of what I said. Here's an example of where we would go to the community in advance, and that's when we talk about our declining enrollment, and when we have an opportunity to have a study done first, which I think is important so we have the actual data, right? And again, it's that sense of trust that we've brought in an outside company to do this. It's not Mike Lonze saying this is what our efficiency is. It's this company saying this is what our efficiency is. And just sharing that information with the community and then asking questions to say, what does this data say to you? What do you think the next step should be? And it's important on a situation like that we're setting a compass, right? We're heading in this direction to identify, do we need to right size? Do we need to redistrict? Getting your opinion, getting your feedback is important to start that process. And then to continue that feedback throughout the process continues to be important. So I hope that gives you a little differentiation point in the two examples that I gave.
It does. What I heard is you want to bring some credibility to the questions you're asking, perhaps?
Certainly. I always want to ask credible questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Mrs. Casagrande, you are asking our next question. Thank you.
Yeah, so background, this question comes from, we have a relatively new cabinet, right? So you're relatively new in your interim role, right? And maybe relatively new in the deputy role as well.
Agreed.
So with that in mind, what roles and areas of the superintendent's cabinet do you believe are growth areas for you? And I don't want to choose what those may be. I mean, it may be budgeting, it may be operations, it may be something totally different. But how do you plan to lead and engage the experts within Walled Lake in order to be effective if it's a growth area for you? And tell us about a time when you had to lead something where you weren't the expert. What was the situation and what was the end result?
Sure. So, yes, all of those are growth areas for me. Even though I've done negotiations, even though I've done a number of these jobs, as I mentioned before, I could probably do it the rest of my life and still learn things along the way. I believe that every educator should be dedicated to lifelong learning. And so, although I believe I have some good base knowledge in most of those areas, I learn new things from Mr. Chatfield every time I talk with him. And so that's when I went back to my first round, to ask the questions and then follow up on the questions and follow up on the information that they provide. And so for me, all of it is a growth area, especially, let's just be perfectly honest with each other, I've had a superintendency for 38 days. Let's not act as if I know everything there is to be a superintendent. What I do know, though, is I do know how to lead people. And I have plenty of examples that I've shared with you of how I've led people that haven't necessarily been an area of strength of mine. Competency base is one of those areas that we were developing together. And honestly, that's where I think some of my best learning has come from, when I'm with people that we're learning together and that we have the opportunity to grow together. Now, sometimes it's nice to have an expert in the room so you can cut out some of the steps and go right to, this is where we're at, now how are we going to solve the problem? And so you do that by identifying the situation and by using the right leadership style for that situation. I had mentioned before that I use different leadership styles depending on the situation. And I think that's what a good leader does. It all comes down to those relationships, though, and I feel that our cabinet has that ability, regardless of whether we've been on cabinet for a year and a half or whether we've been on cabinet for 20 some odd years, that we respect each other and we respect what we bring to the table, and we have an amazing level of candor and honesty. And that's what makes us effective, is that we check our egos at the door and we feel comfortable sharing our thoughts and opinions on whatever the topic is. And it truly continues to impress me for the cabinet members that are not trained educators, the way that they can see a situation and be able to offer information to it when it's related to curriculum and instruction and pedagogy, or when it's related to negotiations, and that's not their area of expertise. And so as I look at our cabinet, those are things that I appreciate about our cabinet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lonze. I'm going to ask a question from that came from the audience, just because I want to make sure that these get in. If you are hired for this position of superintendent, would you plan to continue with the things are going in that? Would you continue with how things are going in Walled Lake schools, or do you plan to make changes? I think you spoke a little bit to this, but do you want to elaborate on that? Thank you.
Sure, I'll elaborate briefly on it, then if anyone has additional follow-up questions, I'm happy to answer those. The best thing about the Walled Lake Consolidated School District is we're not a turnaround school district. We don't have turnaround schools. We have great programs. We have amazing leaders. We have fantastic staff. We have very supportive parents, and we have students that love coming to school to learn. And so my job as superintendent is to evaluate the systems and processes that we have in place, the ones that are working well, to continue to enhance and move those forward. The ones that I feel that there's an opportunity for improvement, we look for ways to improve them. And there may be some programs and some operations and systems that just don't fit into as we continue to move forward what we do in Walled Lake. And so that's my job as superintendent, is to manage that process and lead us through that process.
Thank you. One more question. I'm going to kind of combine a couple here, but could you please specify or elaborate on students that are behind in their reading level and how would you attack the literacy gap?
So I believe that we have systems in place at the elementary school that directly can address the literacy gap. Our instructional specialists are the tip of the sword, so to speak, when it comes to solving that problem. To continue to implement our MTSS process so that we can look at data in real time and we can look at students individually. That's one of the, I said the most powerful part of the MTSS process is our core instruction. Good core instruction at the Tier 1 is the most powerful medium to help students improve. But when we have students that are behind, we have Tier 2 interventions that we can do, such as small groups, such as pull-out, and we have Tier 3 where we can actually bring in additional resources to help students, specifically in literacy. Literacy is a very difficult content area to catch students up the older that they get. So we know when we're allocating resources, we want to look at K-1-2 as where we allocate the most amount of resources to help our students when it comes to students that are behind in grade level as related to literacy.
Thank you. Our next question will be from Vice President, Mr. Siegler.
Dr. Lonze, I've got a few that I want to throw out at you. In your prior job, give me an example of a sacrifice you have had to make in order to be successful. Do you believe the sacrifice was worth it? Would you make that sacrifice again?
So I'll use a personal example. Being a high school principal is a lot of time and energy that you're away from your family. Yeah. And there were opportunities that I didn't have a chance to see my kids' game. I didn't have a chance to take them to practice. There were things that I missed out on. And as a dad, as a person, that's a very difficult choice to make. And it was never an easy choice to make. It was a choice that I talked over with my family. It was a choice that they were able to understand why I'm doing what I do, that I have an opportunity to care for, value, and support other families and to be cheerleaders for other families when they might not have a cheerleader. But by no means was that an easy decision for me to make. Do I regret that decision? Based on where our children are now, I don't. I'm very comfortable with the sacrifices that I had to make. I'm comfortable with where I am in my life. But it doesn't mean that I don't think about that and that I don't do the what-if game every now and then to go, maybe it would have been different if I would have made a different decision and not taken on that leadership role. Conversely, I hope that the impact I had in that leadership role outweighs that decision that I made.
And then, that's why I said I had a loaded question on the other side. How do you mentally forge on when you are faced with a large district decision that could have a lose-lose outcome but needs to be made?
Yeah, how about closing schools? That's not a great outcome in any way. So for me, it comes back to what are my core values and what do I believe in? And it comes down to how do I care for, value, and support the Walled Lake family? And by Walled Lake family, I mean all of us. And every one of us have a stake in the game when it's a decision made like that. And so I give it the best thought that I can. I go back to what would I want to experience as my family if someone else was making the decision for them. And if it's the right decision for my family, then I think it's the right decision for the Walled Lake family. Now, obviously, there's many more variables, slightly more complicated, but to the brass tacks of your question, that's how I look at myself in the mirror in the morning.
Thank you.
Mr. Titus?
Mr. Peterson?
Dr. Lonze, can I follow up just a little bit?
Sure.
We've had several questions so far, and this one I think kind of factors in there. Is there an area in the district now, going forward, that you think are areas that we need to strengthen? And if they are, can you identify them?
I'll identify one for you. It's our cooperative education program. We have, let me ballpark it, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000-ish, 4,000 or 5,000 students at our high schools. And we have less than 100 participating in our cooperative education program. Mm-hmm. And what co-op does is it allows our students to potentially, and they don't have to, but they can reduce their class load at the school and they can get credit for the world of work. I was a co-op coordinator. I think that's an area that we can improve in. Now, it'll be costly. I just want to be transparent about that because there's only so many students a co-op coordinator can have per hour of release. And if we were to do that for every student that has a job, that would be a significant increase in FTE. But we have students, and I've done this myself as a principal, that are behind in credits and they're working and they're taking a full a full class load, that's an opportunity for us to work with those students. And I don't want to imply that our counselors aren't having those conversations. I know that they are. I just believe that that's an opportunity for us to show growth and to help support our students more than what we are now.
And Dr. Lonze, just a quick follow-up, and that's the only area you see off the top of your head right now going forward?
Well, that is one area. Another area that I think we can continue to work on is the new staff member orientation to help build that part of being a sense of the Walled Lake family. Again, I believe that's our long-term solution to our labor problem, is to continue to build that culture and climate within our district that people want to work here, they want to stay here, and they want their friends to work here. Ultimately, all of you know that when you talk to your friends, you talk about, why don't you bring your child to Walled Lake because we're a great school system for someone to get an education. I want that same conversation to happen with our staff members. So that would be a second area that we can continue to improve upon.
Thank you, Dr. Lonze. I'm going to have a couple more questions from the audience. How does competency-based education affect the special needs population where students are in a gen ed classroom setting rather than a self-contained classroom?
And that's great, because competency-based fits right into making sure that all students are successful. Because oftentimes, again, when we have a one-and-done assessment, that doesn't benefit anyone. So for students that have a range of needs and abilities, competency-based allows you to retake, to relearn, to be a part of that process over time. Many of the concept of competency-based is based on that individualized instruction that we're able to provide to our students who are in our special education department. It's also based on the standards that elementary teachers have always been doing. They just haven't always named it as standards-based education. So to me, competency-based is a leveler for everybody. It's allowing equal access. It fits into the universal design for learning, which helps with inclusion for all of our students to be successful. So it fits into it. It definitely supports it.
And one question more. What improvements or changes would you make in to improve the mental health of the students in the district?
I'm proud of the work that we did last year by increasing the social work support that we were able to do at all of our elementary schools. I mentioned it before that we were able to move into a full-time social worker in every elementary school, which continued to help our students at the secondary level. A second layer that we have is to continue to build our relationship with Easter Seals. We are so fortunate to be, a school district that works with Easter Seals, and the amount of support that they provide to us. Our counselors continue to refer students to Easter Seals for low cost to free counseling. And that's something that we can continue to partner with and improve so that our students can have the mental health support that they have. Also, it should not be taken lightly that all of our building principals have been working with their staff to help our students in the social emotional part of, again, becoming students again and learning the way of the building, whatever building that they're in. And that's something that has been a major focus for all of our schools in the first week of school, is this is what it's like to be a knight. This is what it's like to be a wolf. This is what it's, and that right there is helping the mental health of our students, because when you, as I mentioned, when you feel a part of something, when you feel connected to something, you want to be a part of it.
Okay, and thank you. And as we wind our time down, I would like you to leave us with an overview of what your vision is moving forward if you become superintendent.
Sure. My vision moving forward is to make sure that at the very most basic level that we care for, value, and support our students, our staff, and our community, that we continue to build the Walled Lake family, climate, and culture, that our students are successful not just academically, but they're successful in clubs, they're successful in activities, they're successful in athletics. And that, again, is all means all. All students have access to that. As a building principal, I always ask, the first question I'd ask a student is, what else are you involved in? What are you connected with? And that's something that I'm very proud of what we have here, and something that I would continue to foster and develop. I've mentioned before where I believe we should go with our student achievement and the way that we can help increase student achievement. I've also mentioned how we can continue to enhance our safety and security protocols, because we know if staff, students, and our community don't feel safe in our schools, everything else we talked about today really doesn't matter. And so we'll continue to focus on the safety and security. We'll continue to focus on an innovative approach to student achievement, and we'll continue to focus on allowing access for all students so that everyone can have access to our wonderful educational system that we have here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
At this time, again, for our audience members, you please complete the comment forms. And thank you very much, Dr. Lonze. And at this time, we are going to take about a 5-minute recess. Thank you.